Where is everyone? Hello. I totally dropped the ball on uh, sending out a reminder. So my apologies to you and everybody else. Uh, um, well, I'm not going to go, we're not going to go super long tonight. I was thinking maybe like 45 minutes, an hour. And then I'll cut everybody loose. Yeah, my flight got messed up last night, and so I had to crash in LA, and then had to take a super early flight up here, and we've been rushing around doing stuff all day, and so I just like I didn't get my laptop set up or anything like that. So I'm just gonna riff a little bit on kind of the buildup of colonialism and industrialism and its eventual bang into World War I. Okay, so when I was thinking about this and kind of what we'd be covering and kind of the significance of this time period for tonight's class, I was thinking about just civilization in general, because in in a lot of ways, you can maybe make an argument that the Western civilization is at its peak in like 1900. They the countries have just divvied up all of Africa and Asia and the Middle East and China and um, more or less ruled the world and in many of the significant ways, that civilization is our global civilization today. I mean, that's what colonialism is, right? But and it's not all bad though, right? That we kind of have a global healthcare system that more or less speaks the same language. Education is, it's pretty standardized the way Western education, modern, education in the industrial revolution, where you've got classrooms. It's not like tutorage and, small peer groups. So that's not to say, oh, thank you for telling me. Let me let me go just off Bluetooth. Okay. Well, hopefully you can still hear me. um, like, so it's not, I don't know that one form of education is better than the other, but we have kind of a standardized thing of that now. Um, English is the lingua franca. It's, the common language. It's the language of diplomacy and um, like business and law, in so many places. Um, so like what's going on in Western societies around the turn of couple of centuries ago, um, is I think there's a real yeah argument that somebody can make to say, look, hey, we kind of maybe we peaked right then, um, because the war is coming. And nobody knows that in 1914. But I think there's definitely a sense amongst people that, like, hey, this is not all leading to greatness, but that is a small minority. I think most people feel like their lives are uh, uh, hopeful, that society is trustworthy, that you could trust your neighbor. And there was such a greater sense of communal identity. Uh, Pretty much anywhere you go, even in rural places that are very spread apart. In some cases, the neighbors are looking out for each other more than ever because there's they don't have other resources. Certainly, like different immigrant neighborhoods and communities. Uh, there's a sense of like looking out for one another. Um, but I think society, like the fabric in general, of like all of what it is, people had faith in it for sure. In 19, well, certainly necessarily ideal. Right? We talked about Plessy Ferguson last week. Um, I mean, segregation is the law of the land in America. Anti-Semitism and racism against the Jews is like the law of the land everywhere in Europe. It's not just the Germans. This is like Europe's racism. It manifests in anti-Semitism for the most part. I mean, there's other ways that Europeans are racist, but that's kind of their dark history that they're not dealing with at the time, clearly. Um, but like in the case of the Holocaust, that hasn't happened yet, right? Like we don't think about like modern democratic Christian societies uh genociding people like that. No, we're in progress land. Even after World War I, people, that still hadn't happened yet. And so so folks looked at like each other, their neighbors, differently than you know people do after that. The So like the war hadn't happened, the Holocaust hadn't happened, and cities were still, like in America, cities were newer things. So there was the development of like urban crime and urban decay. Like in cities, murder rates are way higher. And it's not because cities are evil, it's because there's a lot more people and they're bumping into each other, and it's easier to try to like stay a little anonymous and hide if you're in a huge place that has millions of people versus like if you're in a little country bumpkin town with like 300 folks in it, like everybody knows everybody's business. Um, so, but even saying that, like the urban crime that they have in even New York City in 1900 pales in comparison to the urban crime we have in Lancaster or even, up here in Portland. I mean, some cities are worse than others in terms of safety that way. So, like, these problems were there, and they're the byproduct of industrialization, right? These kind of like a whole different type of crime. Um, And this is where, like, we start to see serial killers popping up. Um, like Jack the Ripper is one of the most infamous ones. I think he was the 1870s. I should know that one better. He was, he was serial killer, ran around killing women. I actually just read that they think they have identified the actual guy who was like in jail for violent crimes and rape, and was out for like, I don't know, like six months, a year, whenever he was killing people, and then it stopped because he got put in an insane asylum. And like he fits like all of the criteria for it. Like I just read this probably last week. So I thought that was interesting, like some historic forensic detective accounting. Um, but why do serial killers start showing up after industrialization? Right? That's not a coincidence. Yeah, there had been psychopaths in the past, right? Like Nero or Caligula. They were homicidal lunatics. Like they were I guess they might be um serial killers today, but I think like people like that had much more to do with their power and their kind of like godlike status on earth, and the just unrestrained people that have power, which is rare and not shared, typically. So anyways, we get up to the industrialization, and all of a sudden people are um, wigging out, and for all kinds of different reasons, but like schizophrenia and kind of modern psychoses that like I'm sure existed before industrialization, but it's uh, something about our modern society. It squeezes people, and so I think like it those sometimes those things manifest as a result of like the pressurization of modern society. And indeed, like, people, we're talking about Ford, right? People got so bored with these jobs or felt so tired because they couldn't work at their own rhythm. They had to like keep pace with the machine, right? And so like that changes the natural way and the natural rhythm that your ancestors lived by for hundreds of thousands of years. Um, so but like nobody's really, no, the word serial killer isn't used till I think the 70s, right? 70s, early 80s. Um, if you want a really fun show to watch, well, fun is not the right word. I mean, it's about serial killers. It's disturbing, but it's so good. It's like a David Fincher. It's only two seasons, unfortunately, but his series Mindhunter is, oh, it's so good. And it's about the kind of FBI team that essentially started interviewing previous, multi-murderers, and coined the term serial killer and kind of developed profiling and all of that. And it takes place in like the late 70s, early 80s, in the lead up to finding, you know, some of the most notorious ones of the era, and it's fascinating if you think about it, because there were serial killers in the early half of the 20th century, for sure. Like we've got documentation of them, and I think it's very much directly related to industrialization. But the number of serial killers, and yeah, like it rises exponentially after World War II. So, after kind of the horrors of war unfolding a second time and seeing genocide and just like, whoa, It snaps something in people. And to a lesser degree, that's true of World War One. And in the case of both wars, right, they are just horrifically violent, and so much more than war had been ever before, right? So the the American Civil War is really probably one of the it's really probably the first true like large scale modern warfare where the railroad is super important and used and kind of makes or breaks things. It's the first iron sided ships. I mean, they were old wooden ships that they, basically like slapped iron onto and created, more harder to destroy vessels. Um, the Gatling gun, which is like a earlier kind of version of a machine gun. It's much bigger. You can't like really move them around. Um, uh, just explosives. I mean, weapons had gotten much more destructive by 1861. But like industrialization's in early stages there, so like, yeah, the destruction's horrific, and um more Americans die in the Civil War than any of the wars, any other war that we're in. And I think the number almost matches all other deaths of American soldiers in every other war added up. And so um so much of the death, though, it occurred because medicine was so bad. Like they're like, oh, he got shot in the shin, chop his leg off. Oh, we don't wash hands yet. Like in 1860, doctors didn't use soap. Like humans didn't understand germ theory. It's really crazy to think like that's not that long ago, right? But I mean, that's so many people are dying because of that. Medicine gets quite a bit better by 1914 when World War One breaks out. Um, so the deaths they're caused by landmines and mustard gas and getting machine gunned down, not like a single bullet, even. Uh, the explosives just keep getting bigger and bigger during the war, and in between the Civil War and World War One, or the Great War, because they didn't call it that. They don't know another one's coming, right? They just call it the Great War because it's the craziest war that's ever been fought in human history by a million miles. In between those two wars, where we have electrification and lights and electricity and um, telephones. We've got primitive radio. We've got cars, which they developed tanks during World War One, because well, they hadn't really needed them before, but it's hard. You can't really get across a line of machine guns. So one of the reasons this war is just so bloody and costly is because it was fought like how people used to were fighting wars during, like, think of like the American Revolution movies, right? They're all lining up and like taking turns firing at each other. Those bullets, they were round. They were so inaccurate. They just zig around all over the place. I don't even know if rifling was invented yet at that point, but they're slowing down. Like they probably won't hit you. That's why all their guns have bayonets at the ends of them, because you're going to run in and stab each other probably. That strategy just doesn't work very well with machine guns lined up against one another. So that's where the trench warfare comes in and becomes such a costly thing. And trench warfare, the American Civil War had trench warfare, but in the case in the war in Europe, the trenches would go on for miles and miles and miles, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. Basically, they're just extensive. Next week, I think we will probably watch 1917. I've been doing that the last few years with my classes when we get up to uh, World War I, because it's a very compelling movie. It's captivating. The movie is so fast paced. It is just like you feel like it's a half hour long because it's just like what's going on. It's just point of view of a soldier on this mission in the trenches, and so it gives a real submersive feeling to um, really get like, oh, the moment that this is in our history. And yeah, you've got airplanes in this war. There's a great scene with a couple airplanes. I mean, it's primitive airplanes, right? They're like they're shooting at each other with like handguns from the airplanes. Sometimes they're like open cockpit, crop dusters. Um, but I mean, for reconnaissance, for spying, for relaying information quickly, like these are all new things that humans have developed in between that like 50-year window, that all get turned into just horrible, horrible, horrible weapons, that we use against each other, right? Like nuclear power is amazing. Nuclear weapons are a tragedy. Were they inevitable? It kind of feels like we can't help but weaponize our technology. And I think that's kind of like one of the biggest takeaways about the Great War is that before the war there was a much greater sense of like hope in the progress that technology is bringing us, that it is making us better people, we're living in a better world, things are safer. um After the war, though, that changes. People are more weary of their technology. They're more aware of the potential that our new world has to kill us in so much greater fashion than the previous worlds. Um, I've said like I've kind of been a little bit of a theme that for most of human history, I mean, humans are kind of afraid of everything, but nature is like what's going to get you like that. Be afraid of nature. Um, but as we develop all this technology to uh, protect ourselves against nature, we start hurting nature. We start changing the uh, ecosystems that we live in, right? Unique species die. Greenhouse gas effect is destroying our ability to live here. Um, just so many things, right? Well, we can actually like harm nature. Humans haven't really been able to do that before, the start of this our class. Like we're still worried about nature, and our ability to hurt each other is much more limited than like nature is, right? Like you can have a massive, huge earthquake somewhere, and if you're looking at like early industrial and pre-industrial stuff, it's like, oh, 40,000 people died in Pakistan when an earthquake happens. Like that's crazy. That even large armies, like that's not people. Those are not numbers that people are dying in usually, even during like war and battles. But pretty quickly the numbers shift, right? And we get a lot better about building engineering and civic integrity and like earthquake preparedness and all those things that where okay, earthquakes happen, and if they are happening in places that are old, there's still kind of high death tolls. But if it's in places that have been retrofitted and modernized, and then it's relatively like contained damage, unless it's something like Fukushima, right? The nuclear reactor that melted down when a tidal wave slammed into it after an earthquake in Japan. Um, that's like that is harming our world. So yeah, in terms of like civilizations, then right, we are the inheritors today of that civilization. Um, and I think there's continuity there. Like I think it's still kind of the same. If you compare like our civilization today to like the Roman Empire, right? We're not that far away from the Western world of 1900, but we are globalized now. There's so much more interconnectedness than there was in 1914. And one of the reasons that gets us to where we are today in terms of interconnectedness is because of the wars. They speed along the process of globalization, right? And particularly at the start of World War One, um, it's not only the biggest war that Europe's ever seen, uh, and like the wars 100 years before with Napoleon, they were pretty big. They had huge fighting going on, but there'd been basically 100 years of peace in Europe. So Europe, which is famous for fighting each other forever, had relative stability for a century. So I think they're very hopeful about kind of a new era, a new world of rationality and enlightenment thinking. Um, but they all had colonies, right, all over the world now, and so their fighting is going to take place in these colonial lands. Now they don't have like massive armies in all of these colonies necessarily. I think like Britain and India might be maybe like an exception to that, but um, they the fighting would take place, territory would change hands, and then of course troops are getting called up from these colonies, right? So fighting in Europe, you've got people from Australia and South Africa and India and all over the place, Egypt, that were British colonies at the time. You've got uh, um, people from like West Africa fighting for France, um, and then it's stretched all across Europe. So you've got Russia fighting in the war, and the largest land empire on earth, and so they've got like they have lots of people from East Asia. So this time like and veterans the world to fight all over the world, and then once America joins the fray in 1917, it feels it's truly like a world war. Not to the extent that the next one will be, but the next one is more of a world war because globalization increases so much during the first war and during the 20 so years in between the end of that one and the opening of the next one. And so one of the things that people bring home with them as the war is ending is the pandemic. They bring a bird flu, the yellow fever, or Spanish flu, not the yellow fever, that's a different one. The Spanish flu, it, it wipes out as many people as the whole entire war did. 20 million people die from this, because, well, it took folks a while to realize what was going on and how things were being transmitted, and that it was the same disease all over the place. I mean, think about how long it took for between when reports of this started happening and when we actually oh, we got to shut everything down because this is a pandemic disease. I mean, it was 3 or 4 months, and we're in a much more interconnected telecommunications kind of world than people were in 1919. So the even the consequences of something like flu and disease and um, illness are going to be ways that we start living with more awareness and anxiety of the ways we can die. Like that, there's so many more than getting eaten by wolves. that's that's and we're now in a information age after the end of World War I, because communications uh, improved dramatically during that time because they needed to. Um, so all of these people are spread all over, and they're bringing disease back, but they're also bringing some experience and some understanding of different cultures, and have seen more of the world than probably anybody they would have known 100 years earlier. But then they're also bringing back PTSD, right? They've been exposed to insane horrors, and nobody, no PTSD isn't a thing yet, right? Like that's not identified until well after the second war has ended. And so, of course, uh, if it's not a disease, it's not identified, even though people literally would be shell shocked. Like some people, you can see video, they can't stop from shaking from just their nerves being blown out from literally being bombed at for days on end and just stuck there and you can't move, right? So um the way people deal with it is alcoholism. It's violence. It's you know developing other neurological diseases, right? And so I think that that's why after the wars, in particularly, not just a certain part of industrialization, you see a huge spike in serial killers. I was looping it back around. That was kind of a long trail to follow. Um, and then it jumps after the second war even more because the horrors that people have been exposed to and understand about just humans in general are so much higher. And the world that we live in is so much more manufactured by then. Um, so, I mean, in a lot of ways, the world's pretty rugged still in 1914. But by the 1950s, right, after the Second War is over, suburbs are a thing, which are people have lived in cities and people have lived in the countryside for a long time. People have not lived in suburbs because you kind of need cars to make suburbs work. And so the suburbs are a thing that start popping up around the turn of the century. And um, lo and behold, there is a a connected isolation to kind of suburban life and things becoming even more standardized than they were at the beginning of the century. And I think that the disconnect, the dissonance between that, you know, and it's not often vets that are serial killers. I mean, they can be, of course. Anybody could be a serial killer. That's the scary part. But it's in the mid-century and like into the like 80s. I think a lot of the serial killers, especially the high-profile ones, they're children of like often oftentimes it's they've got childhood trauma from a parent, you know, a father that was in the war, that was affected by the war, that got drug into alcoholism. Um, so you know, in by the time we get up to the end of the 20th century, just just that thought alone, right? Because people were freaked out, man. But by the 80s, uh, yeah, the terror of like serial killers. I feel like that's when like that was like the peak decade of like serial killers on the loose, and some of the most notorious ones ever. And then it starts to peter off in the 1990s, and if you think about it, it probably has quite a lot to do with technology, right? um, CCTV cameras everywhere that we are. Um, and by the time you get into the 2000s, well, actually, even in the 90s, they were doing cell phone tracking, right? And coordinating your location and getting data on you. And just like and DNA, right? DNA and using DNA for um, evidence that all of those things, they make it much harder to get away with murdering a bunch of people, right? Like there there probably were a lot more serial killers amongst us, but they got arrested after they murdered somebody, you know what I mean? Or maybe they got two in. um but those numbers drop, but then what we see just go through the roof, starting in kind of the mid 90s, is school shootings, and mass shootings in general. And, um, you know, I think they're way different things than each other, serial killers and mass shooters, but their rise and fall can't be coincidental either. You know what I mean? That's they're too related. If you wanted to hurt people, hi, um, like if you want to hurt a lot of people and you know that you're probably going to get caught if you go murder somebody, that I mean, I think whatever's often somebody that would make them want to do something like that, the there's an appeal now to one over the other. It's a very weird thing to think about, but these are the things that kind of get produced from this experience of industrialized war, um, that we're going to see ourselves walk ignorantly hopeful into. You know, like I said, progressives thought the war would be a good thing. I um yeah, so like the progressives thought the war would be great. They thought it'd be helping everybody. Oh, I can't talk right now, buddy. Okay, go back inside, okay? It's my buddy's kids. Sorry about that. Um, and by the time the war's over, though, nobody's really hopeful about anything. Nobody's thinking, "Oh, great, this produced better technology." I think people are very aware that
we've kind of unleashed hell on earth. And it is why, to keep in mind why people are so reluctant to actually stand up to Hitler. And I don't necessarily mean the German people. I mean like the rest of Europe, right? Because the League of Nations is going to get developed out of, um, out of the war, the aftermath of uh, this horrible thing, the treaty that's going to solve it, the Treaty of Versailles. It's a mess. I mean, you'll read about it. I've got a whole section on it because it's one of the most consequential documents in world history. In some ways, it's in part responsible for triggering the Great Depression. And it's certainly responsible for the rise of a strong man dictator like Hitler. Had the nations involved, the victors, done what America and the United Nations do after World War II, had they done that during the first one, which is like, okay, we're going to make you de-arm and you can't have a military, but we're going to, install like democratically elected governments for you people and make you part, members of this league, and we're going to invest in you financially to help you rebuild your country instead of making you pay a bunch of money to all the people, like they just lost the war. You're not flush with money. um uh they make them pay war reparations, make them admit war guilt. Like, hey, it's our fault. We caused the whole war, which is like, I don't think that's very accurate. Like the nations of Europe went to war against each other. They were all hot to trot for it. Their nationalism was at, peak levels in all of these countries. They all thought they were better than, each other and destined to kind of rule the world. And so and then they also have like historical grievances with each other that go back hundreds of years. So that, everybody wanted to go out. And so this document, it just creates horrible conditions that Germany struggles under to recover from the war. Um, this, yeah, this treaty that takes place, the president um, uh, sets up is the League of Nations, saying like, hey, look, if we get a collection of countries together, that we have a like world forum essentially to work out diplomatic differences and understandings for kind of everybody. Which, I mean, you and me, we've all grown up in the world of the United Nations, so I just think that's normal. That makes sense in a globalized world, is that you'd have something like that. But that didn't used to exist. Everybody was just out on their own, making their own diplomatic deals kind of independently of one another. And so uh, this is kind of a new idea. It's a novel idea, and America doesn't join it. So Woodrow Wilson gets back, and a conservative senator rails against joining this, calls it, uh, uh, just like a globalist. Like, this is such a bad thing. We need to be America first. We can't be, beholden to have to um, go to war if one of these other nations that we're partnering with is attacked. Like, we need to be able to make our own decisions about things like that. And that sentiment that was pretty strong in a lot of people after the Great War, because Uh, Americans were kind of divided about joining the war in the first place, which we don't present it that way in movies, or in our history books usually. But I mean, think about the largest immigrant groups in America at the time were like Italian Americans, German Americans, and Irish Americans. And Ireland remained out of the war. Uh, but they hate the British. Like they were like, yeah, go to war against Britain. Like they, the Irish Americans were, for the most part, they were very like anti-interventionist and anti-British and didn't want America to enter the war in that way. So, um, and then even Americans that might have been pro joining the war and pro Britain, um, a lot of Americans lost somebody that they knew, or somebody came back broken from the war. And so, the thought of having to join another European war, because I think in Americans' view, it's like those crazy people are always going to war, which they historically have. So we don't join, and it's spells the almost certainty of World War II in some ways, because people we don't when the world doesn't have the political apparatus to really control things, and um, without America's involvement and military industrial backing behind it, it's pretty weak. It's pretty impotent. Um, yeah, yeah. So it really sets the stage for stuff that's unresolved to get resolved. I think that's probably good. Good place to stop, to pause. Kind of giving you the lead up and overview of the wars that way. So your test is due this Sunday by midnight if you haven't taken it yet. And then, like I said, I think we'll watch 1917 and talk about it a little bit afterwards. It's definitely, because it's one of those movies you want to talk to somebody about after seeing, like, oh my God, I can't believe that scene or whatever. It leaves an impact. And then, yeah, we can just kind of talk about the film and talk about the war a little bit afterwards. So, bring your popcorn, bring some snacks, uh, and we'll have a good time with that next week. All right. Any questions? Or I see there was chat. Let me see. Okay. Well, without any further ado, then thank you guys for joining me and hopping on tonight.
Sorry to interrupt, but what's
yeah.
the format for the test?
So it's online. It's on Canvas, and it's mostly multiple choice. And then I think in all the tests I've got like some matching sections. So like it might be match this author to this work, or match this inventor to his invention, or I'm not sure, like stuff like that. And then some true or false.
And just to make sure, it's chapters 1 through 5, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, I think it's only chapters 1 through 4. I could be wrong on that. Well, read through 5 and just in case, anyways.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was fun chatting about serial killers with you guys. I will see you next week.
Have a good night.
Bye.